The Rockery, memorialized in locally quarried stone, in red bricks and orange tiles, Oliver and Oakes Ames, side by side for eternity, gaze upon and silently manipulate the complex of shops which magnificently proclaim the entrepreneurial successes of these brothers. The Rockery, the first and the most unusual design created by Frederick Law Olmsted in Easton, 1881, was by a commission given to that landscape architect by Oakes Ames and Governor Oliver Ames. The intent of the design was to be a Civil War monument and also to be a viewing point for the adjacent Oakes Ames Memorial Hall and Ames Free Library. Olmsted may have envisioned his creation as a kind of a public square about which would be gathered the designs of his friend Henry Hobson Richardson and a school then but a bit to the south. The Rockery, soon after the placement of the massive boulders which define it, and prior to any vegetative plantings, loomed as a fortress surrounded by the moats of Main Street, Lincoln Street, and Barrow Street. The natal Rockery, with its walls of virgin and immense rocks, may not be greatly dissimilar to the exterior walls of the Gate Lodge at the Langwater Estate. The mover of the ice epoch willed to the Easton community an abundance of stony building material, some of it which was arranged for the wonder of an analysis by humankind. The Rockery, with an archway running through it, that archway having as its functional assignment an easy departure from or access to Main Street and Lincoln Street, and its aesthetic assignment of echoing the Romanesque arches of the Richardson buildings, was and continues to be a portal, an imposing entrance. Here, many have delightfully viewed the panorama of the Ames monuments. Here, school children, on selected holidays, have brought and laid at the base of the giant flagpole their offerings of stones, symbolizing remembrance and recollection. Here many have swayed and tapped to the rhythms and the tunes of whole and half notes projecting from the band shell. Here many have savored the joy of buttered and salted popcorn. Here many have awaited the arrival of the morning and afternoon mail deliveries. And here many have shared a first, an impulsive, and a controlled hug and bus. Here many have gathered about the monument honoring those who served in World War II and the Korean conflict. Here many have gathered to revel in the spirited Festival of Lights, exemplified on the 16th of December in the year of our Lord 1994, by Thomas Grant, who sought the hand of Siobhan Donovan beneath the Rockery arch, resplendent with the beauty of the glittering festive lights of the holiday season. A decision was made in or near to the year of 1947, which resulted in the commencement of the demise of the Rockery. The operation of dismantlement commenced on the eastern end of this granite outcropping. For a reason or reasons now not easily recalled, a decision was made to halt the eradication of the Rockery. The portion of the eastern end which has been removed has not been restored. In 1975, the year in which the town of Easton celebrated its bicentennial, one of the many proposals to highlight this celebration was the restoration of the partially deformed Rockery. That proposal was not fulfilled. The decision to not remove the Rockery was, for we who continue, a blessing. this portal of Easton continues in its function of providing a door, a gate, to the accumulated gifts which are personified by the Rockery. The arch at the gate lodge. The knobby texture of the exterior walls of the gate lodge of the Langwater estate is simultaneously a toxin and a balm. The exterior walls of the gate lodge simultaneously sicken or soothe the seer. The healing and the common link of these extremes is the generous Romanesque arch, which is a renowned portal of Easton. Under the watchful eye of the squinting window just above the arch, time and people have passed to and fro. Mr. Frederick L. Ames commissioned Mr. Henry Hobson Richardson in 1880 to design a gate lodge to be sited at the northern entrance of Langwater. The intent of Mr. Ames was that the new building would be a residence and not simply an outbuilding much subordinate to the main residence. In honoring the request of his client, the gate lodge developed into a two-story residence block to the west of the entrance lane and a single-level wintering house to the east of the entrance lane. The Romanesque arch served a number of needs of the architect. The arch allows a framed and a sheltered entry into the estate, and the arch provides a horizontal transitional vehicle which effectively connects two units of differing heights. The arch connects and visually melds the two distinct units into one entity. The arch does well its assignments. This outstanding portal of Easton reminds us of an age of elegance. This portal of Easton, this doorway to the romance of history, is a visual reminder of the generous inheritance which honors the citizens of this town. Hi, I'm Bob Mizowitz, your host for our weekly program, The Portals of Easton. We're going to travel back through time and explore historical sites, hear ghost stories from the past, meet people who will tell us what life was like growing up in Easton many years ago. Won't you come along? In this journey, we're going to get acquainted with Ed Hands, teacher, historian, author of Easton's Neighborhoods. Ed Hands, the man, the author. Friends, we're going to spend an evening with a man who has explored the portals of Easton's past. Enjoy with me.
30 years ago was a lot less well developed than it is today. I lived out on the Bay Road at that time, and there were still working farms there. As a matter of fact, I lived on a poultry farm. Right next door to us was a dairy farm. Up the road was another working dairy farm that supplied milk for Producers Dairy. And it was kind of almost a 19th century existence. We'd ride up and down the road on our bikes and play football and baseball and fish in the summertime. And to me, looking back on it, doesn't seem much different than some of the people I read about at the turn of the century or earlier. Once we came to the big city up here in Northeastern, of course, we had excellent education. Things were pretty much state-of-the-art. We were, at that point, growing fairly rapidly, even though we didn't perceive it. And so we moved into a relatively new high school building when I went into 10th grade. And by the time I came back here as a senior in college to student teach, they were in the process of adding an addition onto that. That's the junior high school building now. And then, of course, we eventually built the new high school. So I came in at just the beginning of the period of the great growth. But when I was here, places where there's subdivisions today was all woods. And I have no sense of direction, so I managed to get myself lost in most of those woods, and that was a real education about Easton. Well, the most memories is Bay Road, where I lived. Strangely enough, when we were just finishing up the book, my editor, Hazel Varela, noted that I should mention all the milestones on Bay Road other than the 4 I had put in the text. And it was really funny. The one that I had left out was the one that was in front of the house where I lived when I first came to Easton. And I said, you know, that's the reason I'm interested in the history of Easton, because that stone was such a mystery to me when I came here as a 12-year-old that I began to read Reverend Chaffin and look around and pay more attention to the cellar holes and things like that. Well, I've always been interested in history, and I became particularly inspired after I found out that my first choice of careers, which was being an engineer, wasn't going to work because my math skills weren't quite there. But I could also say I was inspired by several people that I had in high school. Hazel Varela and Buddy Worcester both inspired me and pushed me in the direction of Easton's history, showed me how fascinating it really was. And I've been happily...
So Buddy did this through his English?
Well,
For English,
I had him for English, and he inspired a love of great literature there. I also had him for driver ed, and he knew I was interested in history, so he was always telling stories there as he was, clutched white-knuckled to the car about all the different spots that we passed by. And I remember making a promise to him. I said, one day I'm going to write a history like Chaffin did, and this is my start.
Let's explore the pages of Easton's history.
Historians in general in the 19th century were more or less interested in telling the story, getting the facts down, and in local history in particular, making sure that nothing was lost, so that local histories tended to be very, very detailed. But historians in the 20th century began to look at the whys behind the fact. Why were houses built here in Northeastern? Why were certain areas of the town undeveloped? What was the interaction like between the immigrants and the Yankees? And I tried to answer some of those questions. The original question that I started with was, why did the original settler settle where he did? And that turned out to be the central foundation for the whole book, because I believe he settled where he did because of the potential water supply there. Then as I began to look at the other neighborhoods, everything began to fall into place. Neighborhoods got development if they had water supplies. And Northeastern, with the best water power, became the largest and best developed of the neighborhoods. There are exceptions. Easton Center has absolutely no water power at all except Black Brook, which you can jump across even in the spring. But it was at the center of everything and became a common meeting ground. Well, the largest neighborhood in terms of pages in my book is Northeastern. Now, the folks down in Eastondale said, gee, we never wrote down our history because they told us it wasn't important, only Northeastern was important. But that's not true. Northeastern was the largest in population for quite a while. It was also, back in the turn of the century era, the first one to have district government, where it had its own police department, fire department, and water department. Ultimately, those evolved, and those of other districts in town, evolved into the town systems that we have today.
Ed, what distinguishes Northeastern from the other 9 neighborhoods?
Well, in the 18th century, what distinguished Northeastern was the tremendous power of the Queesit River, which drops about 30 feet as it passes through Northeastern. That led to the development of the shovel company in the 19th century, because Oliver Ames was attracted by this source of power. Once the shovel company got here, Northeastern took on the traits of an urban neighborhood, unlike all the others in Easton.
Did vocations cause the development of the neighborhoods in any way?
Yes. My thesis is that it was the water power along the 4 river systems in town that attracted the early settlers. Water power was an opportunity for industry. The neighborhoods that didn't have a stream running through it were developed later and were primarily agricultural. So there was definitely a difference. However, I think the idea of neighborhoods really coalesced around the idea of the local grammar schools.
Interesting. Why did you choose the 10 neighborhoods to write about? Why not 4 or 2 or 3?
Well, that ties into the idea I just mentioned about the grammar schools. In the mid-19th century, there were scheduled to be 11 grammar schools in Easton. Remember, there were no school buses in those days, so the school had to be within walking distance. Ultimately, 10 of those schools were built, and that became the framework for the idea of 10 neighborhoods. Some of the neighborhoods are well known, such as Pequannock or Easton Furnace or North Easton.
What about Unionville?
Yeah, and not to forget Unionville, one of our smaller neighborhoods, but certainly one that's had a lot of interesting history. The other neighborhoods, like the Haywood Pool neighborhood and the Howard neighborhood, once originally shared a school, but because the Howard neighborhood was primarily agricultural and the Haywood Pool neighborhood had a stronger mixture of part industry and part agriculture, I decided to make them separate neighborhoods. So it doesn't quite match the 10 grammar schools, but almost.
And also makes for a longer book.
That's right.
All right.
Well, I think Easton was an inventive town because of Yankee ingenuity, and I guess that also goes back to the cliche, necessity is the mother of invention. If you look at Easton in the late 18th century, you find out that the farmland had been pretty much divvied up among sons and grandsons to such an extent you really couldn't make a great living as a farmer. And within 20 years of that, new land opening up in New York and then further west in Ohio and Illinois made it even more of a challenge to be a general farmer here. So a lot of sons took what was a relatively good education. You know, there's some great stories about how poor education here was in Easton. We once hired a crazy minister to be a school teacher. He failed as a minister because he gave sermons from sun up to sundown, only stopping when the sun went down, but I guess they found that useful in the teacher. Even though the education was kind of questionable compared to some more affluent communities, there was enough education here that people could seek out other ways of making a living than being a farmer. There was also that water power with grist mills and sawmills, and around 1800 it became apparent that water power could be used to turn machineries to make textiles, and then people began to think of other things like making nails with water power, making wire with water power, coming up with a whole line of inventions. So anybody that had an idea was free to try it, and unlike today when getting an idea to market might cost a few $1,000,000, if you could get $1,000 in capital, you could get started, and a number of people here in Easton did that. My favorite inventors are probably the Poole family of Easton, mainly because I've done a lot of research on them, along with a friend of mine, Bob Vogel, who is the leading collector of Poole memorabilia. And that's a real fascinating story because they were making precision mathematical instruments, surveying instruments, coming up with some designs on their own, and competing with the Europeans who had a several hundred-year head start and access to better tools and things like that. And they were able to sell successfully throughout most of the 19th century, meeting that competition. So that's a great success story. On the other hand, some of the textile people here were a great surprise to me. I knew, you know, Easton is famous for its shovels, and I knew there were a lot of sawmills and grain mills and things like that around. But it was easy to forget that once upon a time there were a lot of little textile and thread factories in town. Some of these people, the Morse family in particular, were very inventive. One of the Morses even invented a lace-making machine.
How do you think Easton has changed through the years?
Well, from my perspective in writing the book, the boundaries of the neighborhoods have joined together. It's become more and more one town. Up until the 20th century, there were still heavy controversies between the various parts of town. And I think that is beginning to fade away, although every once in a while you hear about, well, our fire station isn't open and the northeastern one always is, things like that. But that's beginning to fade away as transportation and growth have made the town into more of one unit. Other changes are that it's gone from being a farming community to a community where there was a lot of industry. Don't forget that the Ames Shovel Company made 3/5 of the world's shovels at one time, to being a bedroom community where there's very little business. I shouldn't say business. There's quite a bit of business still, but there's very little industry. It's all commercial enterprises now.
Right. Why do you think Easton is a unique community?
Well, it's unique in several ways. From a historian's point of view, people saved things around here. The documentation of the 18th and 19th centuries is particularly good. There's a lot of material left around. It's also unique in that it had a huge industrial site, and yet it never had any labor strife. It was a community that was able to avoid the problems that plagued other industrial towns. It also kind of just grew. It wasn't a planned community, and it's fun to watch the different patterns of growth. Each neighborhood has a unique pattern of growth. Well, a favorite ghost story would be one that would make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You know, I mean, some ghost stories don't do very much for me. There's a ghost story about people in a house and hearing rocks fall on their roof, and it doesn't scare me very much. You know, those kind of stories you begin to look around for like rational explanations. But the Daniel Wheaton house has the one that makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and it's a very harmless ghost, but it seems to be incredibly persistent. As a matter of fact, it may be more than one ghost. Many years ago, the Globe did an article on ghosts of New England, and they happened to have a motorist story. And this motorist was driving down Bay Road near the Wheaton house on a foggy night when he was forced to slow down because he saw a lantern ahead of him. It was an old-fashioned lantern. It wasn't a flashlight or anything like that. And as he slowed down, the beams of his headlights caught the lantern and the ghostly figure in white of a woman walking across from the barn to the main house. That's a nice story. But in doing research on the house, you begin to find out more about this ghost. One of the earlier occupants of the house reported seeing the ghost in the center window above the door, a woman in white staring out the window. Another person that lived in the house told the story of being in the house alone and hearing someone, she knows not who, whistling Yankee Doodle. So this one gives me the creeps because it seems to be the most definitive ghost in Easton. It's not one sighting, it's repeated sightings over a number of years by different people, and you know, you wonder, maybe there is something to this. I had another interesting ghost story about a house nearby here, and it was told to me by a person who, over the phone, I never did get a chance to meet him, who had lived in Queeset House for a while, and he reported seeing ghostly figures there. A wizened old man who came into his room when he was kind of half asleep and stayed staring at him at the end of the bed for, he said, it seemed like hours he was there. And then he reported seeing a ghostly woman in 19th century, late 19th century maid's clothes, you know, high-necked blouse and with the long puffy sleeves, the typical housekeeper you see in these 19th century movies, dusting furniture. And the thing that gave that kind of a little twist was he had been so genuinely upset by these specters that appeared that he could no longer stay in the house. He moved out shortly after that. It makes you wonder, though, whether the ghost of Winthrop Ames is still there with a house full of servants. Who knows?
Ed, what was the biggest roadblock you had to overcome in writing this book?
I think there were two. One was my own ignorance. I wasn't familiar with all the neighborhoods and all the intricacies of their history, so I was dependent upon written sources and interviews with other people, and that slowed down the writing of the book. The second one was the fact that almost no one has written down anything about the 20th century in these neighborhoods. The neighborhoods have kind of grown together as the town has expanded, but they still, for the most part, have unique identities. But none of that stuff has been recorded. We tend not to think of our own time as being historically important, and it is.
So nobody to talk to then.
Exactly.
How is your book different from the history of Easton?
I think it's different in several ways. The first one was that Reverend Chaffin lived at a time when you could just talk to people who in turn had talked to people who had lived in the 18th century. In other words, almost the whole history of the town was still part of the oral tradition. He was intent upon capturing as much information as possible. What that meant was a very long book with very little explanation of why things happened. He was so intent on capturing what happened. What I've tried to do is take some of his good stories, but put them in a framework, the framework of how water power influenced the development of neighborhoods. Whereas his chapters might deal with politics or industry, my chapters each deal with a specific neighborhood. Sometimes that leads to a little bit of repetition, but it also leads to a greater focus on things that Chaffin neglected a little bit, such as the important role that Easton played in the early textile industry, for instance, something we tend to forget because the shovel shop became such a dominant force in town.
Obvious question, is there going to be a sequel?
No.
That was cute.
What I'd like to do is not a sequel, but I'm hoping that the publication of the book will trigger people's memories of things they have in the attic, memories of early parts of the 20th century, and I ask in the book for people to send in any errors they find and also to send in any material that they think should be added. So at some point I'd like to come out with a second edition, still based on the concept of neighborhoods.
We'd like to thank Ed Hands for joining us for the first segment of the Portals of Easton. How good are you at Easton's history? Can you meet the challenge? Enter Cablevision's Historic Easton Trivia Contest. Now here's the question. What was on the street below the Rose Garden, which is now the road to Spring Hill Estates? Tricky question, remember. And your answer to David Andrews, in care of Continental Cablevision, 15A Plymouth Drive, Southeastern Massachusetts, 02375. Remember, the first person to send in the correct answer will be given this wonderful replica of an Ames shovel. These fine pewter shovels are available, by the way, at the Historical Society on the second Sunday of the month. The winner will be announced at the beginning of the next journey of Portals of Easton. We at Continental Cablevision hope you enjoyed your journey through the Portals of Easton today. Don't miss our next journey in the exciting series.